In front of more than 200 employees and investors, CEO Grace Madison coldly placed $1 million on the table and declared that the man standing before her could never fix a $200 million jet. Hunter Reed, a single father dressed in a faded work uniform, studied the lifeless aircraft parked on the runway and calmly accepted the challenge. Mocking laughter rippled through the entire hangar. Investors smirked. Engineers shook their heads. 5 minutes later, the engines roared to life. Silence swallowed the entire airfield whole, and every person who had laughed suddenly forgot how to speak. If true stories of stunning reversals and quiet justice move you, stay until the very end to witness this miracle. Apex Horizon Aviation occupied the far edge of a private airfield outside Charlotte, a gleaming complex of glass offices and steel hangars built to serve clients who measured their wealth in private jets rather than houses. The company had built its reputation on precision, discretion, and an unbroken record of flawless maintenance, and that reputation had made Grace Madison one of the youngest chief executives in the industry. She had inherited the company from her father only 3 years earlier, and every decision since had been scrutinized by investors still deciding whether to trust her. At the center of the crisis sat a Gulfstream jet worth $200 million, parked motionless on the tarmac for nearly 3 weeks. It belonged to one of the company's most valuable clients, a logistic conglomerate that used the aircraft to shuttle executives across continents, and its failure had triggered a chain reaction that threatened contracts worth far more than the jet itself. More than 30 engineers had crawled through every panel, every wire, every sensor housing, and none could explain why the engines refused to ignite. Connor Blake, the company's technical director, had built his entire career on confidence, and he wore that confidence like armor even when the evidence around him suggested otherwise. He stood at the front of the hangar each morning delivering updates that grew increasingly defensive, insisting that the failure had to be electrical, that the wiring harness was degrading from age, and that nothing short of a full system replacement would resolve the problem. He proposed tearing out the entire electrical architecture and rebuilding it from scratch, a project that would cost more than $12 million and ground the aircraft for months. Grace listened to these updates with a tightening sense of dread, because every day the jet sat idle was another day her largest client questioned whether Apex Horizon could be trusted with aircraft of this caliber. Investors had begun calling her office directly, bypassing the usual lines of communication, demanding explanations she did not have. Among them was Aaron Foster, the company's largest shareholder, a man whose quiet patience had always unnerved her more than outright anger ever could. It was a former maintenance technician named Walter Doyle, who had once worked alongside Hunter Reed years earlier, who finally suggested a name nobody in the executive offices had ever heard. Walter mentioned him almost reluctantly, as though uncertain whether the suggestion would help or embarrass him, but he insisted that if anyone outside the company could solve this, it would be Hunter Reed. When Hunter arrived at the hangar that afternoon, the reaction was immediate and unkind. He walked in wearing a faded canvas work jacket with frayed cuffs, jeans stained from years of honest labor, and boots that had clearly seen more garages than boardrooms. His hands were calloused, his expression unreadable, and nothing about his appearance suggested the kind of expertise the situation demanded. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the engineers standing near the wing, and Connor did not bother hiding his smirk as he glanced toward Grace. Grace studied the man for a long moment, searching for some sign that Walter's recommendation carried weight, but she saw only a tired father who had driven across town in an old pickup truck after picking up his son from school. She had built her entire career on trusting data over instinct, and nothing about Hunter offered her any data worth trusting. Still, with $12 million on one side of the ledger and nothing but failure on the other, she found herself unable to dismiss him outright. She crossed her arms and asked him bluntly what made him think he could succeed where 30 trained engineers had failed for 3 weeks. Hunter did not flinch at the question, nor did he offer the kind of confident speech she expected from men trying to prove themselves. He simply asked to see the aircraft himself before answering anything, his tone calm in a way that contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding him. Against the protests of her own technical director and against the better judgment of nearly everyone in the room, Grace finally relented. She told Hunter he had one chance to examine the jet, purely as a last resort before they committed to Connor's $12 million overhaul, and she made it clear that her patience for distractions had already run out. As Hunter walked toward the aircraft, the laughter in the hangar faded into a watchful, skeptical silence, the kind reserved for men nobody expected anything from. Hunter climbed the boarding stairs without ceremony, ducking into the cabin and moving toward the cockpit with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. He spent only a few minutes inside before stepping back down and requesting access to several technical bays near the rear fuselage, panels that most of the maintenance crew rarely opened during routine inspections. Connor folded his arms and announced loudly enough for everyone to hear that those panels had already been checked twice, as if repetition alone could prove his earlier conclusions correct. The engineers nearby began exchanging glances, some amused, some irritated, all of them certain they were watching a performance rather than genuine diagnostic work. One technician muttered that the man probably just wanted attention, that anyone could open a panel and look thoughtful. Connor seized on the moment, telling Grace directly that this entire exercise was wasting time they did not have, time better spent finalizing contracts for his proposed system overhaul. Grace felt her patience thinning with every passing minute, the weight of unanswered calls from Aaron Foster pressing on her more than she wanted to admit. She walked toward Hunter, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise of the hangar, and demanded to know whether he had found anything useful, or whether this had all been a waste of everyone's afternoon. The frustration in her tone was unmistakable, the kind that came from watching a problem swallow months of her career while she stood powerless to stop it. Something in Hunter's calm refusal to be rattled pushed her over the edge of careful executive restraint. Before she could stop herself, the words left her mouth in front of the entire hangar, in front of investors, in front of engineers who had failed for 3 weeks straight. She told him that if he could fix this aircraft today, she would personally pay him $1 million out of her own resources, and the moment the words landed, the hangar erupted into stunned murmurs and disbelieving laughter. Hunter turned to face her fully for the first time since arriving, his expression unreadable, and asked her plainly whether she intended to honor that promise if he succeeded. Grace, caught between embarrassment and stubborn pride, refused to back down in front of an audience that was already watching her closely for any sign of weakness. She repeated the offer clearly, deliberately, in front of every employee and every investor present, sealing the bet, with words she could not later pretend she had never spoken. Aaron Foster watched the entire exchange from near the hangar entrance, his expression giving away nothing, though something in his posture suggested he was paying far closer attention than anyone realized. He had spent decades evaluating people in high-stakes moments, and the calm certainty radiating from this stranger in a worn work jacket struck him as far more interesting than anything Connor had presented in 3 weeks of failed reports. He said nothing yet, choosing instead to observe, but his eyes never left Hunter as the man turned back toward the aircraft. Connor tried one final attempt to regain control of the situation, insisting to Grace privately that she had just made a catastrophic mistake in front of the very investors she was trying to reassure. He warned her that agreeing to such a public wager with an unverified outsider would damage her credibility regardless of the outcome, and that backing out now would only make things worse. Grace ignored him, her attention fixed entirely on Hunter, who had already begun walking back toward the aircraft with the same unhurried calm he had carried since stepping out of his truck. When Grace asked how long he would need, expecting him to request hours or perhaps the rest of the day to justify the absurdity of the bet she had just made, Hunter's answer landed in the hangar like a quiet detonation. He told her without a trace of bravado that he needed 5 minutes. The silence that followed was different from the laughter, before it, heavier, sharper, the kind of silence that came when an entire room suddenly began wondering if it had misjudged someone standing right in front of them. Hunter walked back into the cabin without acknowledging the murmurs trailing behind him, his focus narrowing entirely onto the aircraft itself, as though the hangar full of skeptical onlookers had simply ceased to exist. He did not move toward the engines, the component everyone assumed must be at fault, and several engineers exchanged confused glances as he instead crouched near a small avionics bay tucked behind the rear bulkhead. Connor called out that he was wasting his 5 minutes looking in the wrong place entirely, his voice carrying the irritation of a man whose authority felt increasingly threatened. Inside the avionics bay, Hunter's hands moved with a precision that betrayed years of experience no faded jacket could disguise. He traced a bundle of wiring back to a small auxiliary sensor module, a component so minor that most technicians barely glanced at it during standard inspections, since its failure rarely caused anything beyond a minor warning light. But Hunter had spent years designing systems exactly like this one, and he understood something the other engineers had missed entirely. A faulty signal from this single module could cascade through the aircraft's safety protocols, tricking the entire system into believing a catastrophic fault existed elsewhere and locking the engines from ignition as a protective measure. He pulled the module free, turning it over in his palm, and found a hairline crack along its casing so small it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically searching for it. The part itself, he announced to no one in particular, cost less than $50 and could be replaced in under 90 seconds. Connor's expression shifted from irritation to something closer to disbelief, though he quickly masked it, insisting loudly that a part this insignificant could never explain 3 weeks of total engine failure. Hunter ignored him entirely, retrieving a replacement module from a small toolkit he had carried in from his truck, the same toolkit that had drawn quiet snickers when he first arrived. He reseated the new component with practiced hands, reconnected the wiring harness, and closed the access panel with a quiet click that seemed impossibly small for the magnitude of what everyone was about to witness. He stepped back, glanced toward the cockpit, and told Grace simply that she could try starting the engines now. The hangar fell into a silence so complete that the hum of distant ground equipment seemed deafening by comparison. Julian Brooks, the company's chief test pilot, climbed into the cockpit at Grace's signal, his hands hovering over the controls with the practiced caution of a man who had no idea what to expect after 3 weeks of total failure. He ran through the standard ignition sequence, and the entire hangar seemed to lean forward collectively, waiting for the same disappointing silence that had followed every attempt for the past 21 days. Engine number 1 roared to life on the first attempt, the sound tearing through the hangar like a thunderclap after a long drought. Before the gasps had even finished rippling through the crowd, engine number 2 ignited as well, both turbines spinning up with a smoothness that suggested nothing had ever been wrong with them at all. Warning lights that had haunted the cockpit displays for weeks blinked out one by one, replaced by clean green indicators across every system readout, and Julian sat frozen for a moment, staring at instruments that finally told him everything was working exactly as it should. Engineers who had spent 3 weeks insisting this failure required millions of dollars and months of reconstruction stood in stunned silence, some with hands pressed over their mouths, others simply staring at the aircraft as though it might betray them again at any second. Connor's face had drained of color entirely, his earlier confidence replaced by an expression that looked almost like fear, as though he understood that everything he had built his reputation on for the past 3 weeks had just been undone by a single overlooked component. Aaron Foster, still standing near the entrance, allowed the faintest trace of a smile to cross his face, the first genuine emotion he had shown since arriving. Grace stood motionless near the boarding stairs, watching the engines run with flawless precision, watching the warning lights stay dark, watching the impossible become undeniable in front of more than 200 witnesses who would never stop talking about what they had just seen. The smile she had worn earlier, the confident smirk of a woman certain she had just called an obvious bluff, had vanished completely from her face, replaced by something far more complicated. The dawning, uncomfortable realization that she now owed this man everything she had promised, and that the easy part of this entire ordeal had just ended. By the following morning, word of what had happened in the hangar had spread through every department at Apex Horizon, and curiosity about the stranger in the work jacket had hardened into something closer to obsession. Connor, still smarting from the public collapse of his $12 million proposal, demanded that someone investigate who exactly this man was, insisting that no real expert would have shown up looking the way Hunter did, driving the truck he drove, living wherever he apparently lived. He framed it as due diligence, though everyone in the room understood it was wounded pride searching for a way to reclaim some shred of authority. Aaron Foster, however, had already begun his own inquiry the previous evening, unwilling to leave something this significant to chance or rumor. He had connections that reached deep into the aerospace and defense sectors, built over decades of investing in companies that lived or died by the competence of their engineers, and he made a single phone call that afternoon to an old colleague still working in classified defense contracting. What came back within hours stunned even a man as composed as Aaron. Hunter Reed, it turned out, had once served as lead systems engineer for a major defense contractor, heading teams responsible for some of the most advanced military jet programs developed in the past 2 decades. His name appeared on dozens of patents related to avionics safety systems, fault detection architecture, and engine ignition sequencing, the very kind of technical territory that had just saved Apex Horizon from a catastrophic and unnecessary overhaul. Engineers half his age now occupying senior positions across the industry had once studied research papers bearing his name during their university training, never imagining the man behind those papers had simply vanished from the field entirely. The records showed a sharp, unmistakable break nearly 7 years earlier, a sudden resignation from a career that by every measure had been at its absolute peak. There were no scandals attached to his departure, no controversies, no professional disputes that might explain why a man of this expertise would walk away from a six-figure salary and a position most engineers spent their careers chasing. The silence in his file after that point told its own story, one that required no further investigation once Aaron learned the reason behind it. Hunter's wife, Sarah, had been diagnosed with an aggressive illness during the final year of his most demanding project, and within 18 months she was gone, leaving him alone with a son who had just turned 6 years old. He had resigned from the defense contractor less than a month after the funeral, walking away from patents, prestige, and a career built over 20 years, choosing instead a quiet life that allowed him to be present for school pickups, bedtime stories, and the kind of ordinary days his son needed far more than any inheritance of professional achievement ever could. When this information reached Grace later that afternoon, she sat alone in her office for several minutes, staring at the printed summary Aaron had personally handed her rather than simply forwarding through email. She thought of the laughter that had filled the hangar the day before, the dismissive glances, the assumption that a man's worth could be measured by the condition of his jacket or the age of his truck. She thought of her own quick judgment, made in the same instant as everyone else's, and felt something uncomfortable settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the $1 million she now owed him. Grace had built her entire professional identity around data, credentials, and verifiable performance metrics, trusting numbers over instinct because numbers rarely lied to her the way people sometimes did. Yet here was a man whose credentials dwarfed anyone currently employed at her company, a man who had quietly chosen fatherhood over fame, and she had nearly let her own assumptions cost her one of the most capable engineers in the industry. She did not yet know how she would resolve the standoff brewing among her board members over the $1 million payment. But for the first time since the bet had been made, she found herself looking at Hunter Reed not as an embarrassing liability, but as someone she had badly, perhaps dangerously, underestimated. The board convened the following day in a conference room overlooking the very tarmac where the entire spectacle had unfolded, and the mood inside that room bore no resemblance to the awe that had gripped the hangar 24 hours earlier. Connor, having recovered some of his composure overnight, opened the meeting by reminding everyone present that no formal contract had ever been signed, that the verbal exchange between Grace and Hunter held no legal weight whatsoever, and that the company was under no actual obligation to pay a single dollar of the promised sum. Several board members nodded along as he spoke, relief visible on their faces at the suggestion that this entire embarrassing episode might simply be erased through a technicality. One of the company's attorneys, a sharp woman named Patricia Lowe, confirmed that Connor's assessment held up under standard contract law, since the offer had been made spontaneously without witnesses signing anything, without terms being documented, without the basic legal infrastructure that typically protected companies from exactly this kind of impulsive promise. The relief in the room thickened, and for a moment it seemed the matter might be resolved with nothing more than a unanimous vote. Grace sat at the head of the table, listening to the arguments unfold around her, and felt the familiar pull of practicality tugging against something else entirely, something that felt uncomfortably close to conscience. She had made that promise in front of more than 200 witnesses, employees who had heard every word, investors who had watched her shake hands on television coverage that had already reached local news outlets. Backing out now would not erase what had happened. It would only confirm every assumption people made about executives who said whatever was convenient in the moment and abandoned it the instant convenience shifted direction. Aaron Foster, who had remained quiet through most of the meeting, finally spoke, his voice carrying the kind of weight that came from being the largest shareholder in the room. He reminded everyone present that Apex Horizon's entire brand rested on trust, the same trust their clients placed in the company to maintain aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars without cutting corners or breaking commitments. He asked the room plainly what message it sent to walk away from a public promise the moment honoring it became inconvenient, especially when the man they intended to stiff had just saved the company from a $12 million mistake born from their own technical director's incompetence. Connor bristled at the remark but said nothing further, recognizing that arguing too forcefully now would only draw more attention to his failures over the preceding 3 weeks. The room fell into uneasy debate, attorneys weighing legal exposure against public relations risk, board members calculating reputational damage against the relief of saving $1 million they felt they had never truly agreed to spend. Grace listened to all of it, torn between the easy path her lawyers were offering and a growing discomfort she could not quite name yet. Word of the board's hesitation reached Hunter before any formal decision had even been finalized, carried by Walter Doyle, who felt obligated to warn the man he had recommended that the company might not honor its word. Hunter received the news standing in his small garage workshop, surrounded by the modest tools of his current trade, and his reaction surprised even Walter, who had expected anger, or at least bitter disappointment. Instead, Hunter simply nodded, his expression calm in a way that suggested this outcome did not shock him in the slightest. He told Walter, in a tone devoid of resentment, that he had grown accustomed to people failing to keep their word once the moment of gratitude had passed, that promises made in public crisis often dissolved the instant the crisis itself was resolved. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a weary familiarity that suggested this was not the first time life had taught him this particular lesson. He thanked Walter for the warning, returned to the engine he had been repairing for a local client before the interruption, and made no further attempt to contact Apex Horizon, choosing instead to simply walk away from the entire situation without a single phone call demanding payment. In the end, the board voted to withhold payment, citing the absence of any formal agreement and framing the decision as fiscally responsible rather than morally questionable. Grace cast her vote alongside the majority, though something in her posture as she raised her hand suggested less conviction than the rest of the room displayed. Connor, emboldened by the outcome, immediately moved to reassert his authority over the aircraft's maintenance, insisting that the temporary fix Hunter had performed needed to be reviewed, documented, and properly integrated into official company protocols before the jet could be cleared for client use again. He assigned his own engineering team to inspect every system Hunter had touched, partly out of genuine procedural caution and partly, everyone suspected, out of a need to reclaim some professional ground after being humiliated in front of the entire hangar. The team spent days reviewing documentation, running diagnostics, and quietly avoiding any acknowledgement that the $50 component Hunter had replaced represented the actual root cause of 3 weeks of total failure. Connor's official report instead emphasized vague language about residual electrical inconsistencies, conveniently sidestepping the specifics that would have validated everything Hunter had identified. 1 week after the aircraft returned to active service, disaster struck again, though this time the failure presented itself in a far more alarming way. During a routine pre-flight inspection ahead of a scheduled client departure, warning indicators flooded the cockpit display simultaneously, an avalanche of red alerts that no single engineer in the building could immediately interpret. Unlike the previous failure, which had simply grounded the aircraft, this new malfunction triggered cascading errors across multiple independent systems at once, suggesting something far more serious than a single faulty sensor. Connor rushed to the hangar the moment he received the call, his earlier confidence evaporating as he stared at diagnostic readouts that made no logical sense according to any standard he understood. He attempted the same troubleshooting approach his team always relied upon, isolating circuits, replacing components, running test sequences late into the night, but every attempted fix only revealed another layer of malfunction underneath it. Hours passed, then an entire day, and the warning lights refused to clear no matter what his team attempted. Panic began rippling outward from the hangar floor into the executive offices as word reached the logistics conglomerate that owned the aircraft, the same client whose patience had already worn thin during the first 3 weeks of grounding. Their representatives demanded immediate answers, threatening to pull their entire fleet maintenance contract from Apex Horizon entirely if this second failure could not be resolved quickly and transparently. That contract alone represented hundreds of millions of dollars in long-term revenue, and its cancellation would send shockwaves through the company's already fragile standing with investors. Within 48 hours, news of the second failure had reached financial circles beyond the airfield itself, and Apex Horizon's stock value, modest as it was for a privately held company preparing for future public offerings, took a visible hit in confidence among its smaller institutional backers. Board members who had voted to withhold Hunter's payment now found themselves fielding anxious calls from the very investors who had witnessed the original bet, investors beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about why the company had let go of the one person who had understood what was wrong with the aircraft. Grace stood in her office that evening watching the chaos unfold across multiple screens, diagnostic reports updating faster than anyone could meaningfully analyze them, and she felt something close to despair settling over her for the first time since taking over the company from her father. She thought of Hunter's calm explanation, his unhurried confidence, his complete absence of the panic now consuming her entire technical department, and she understood with sudden uncomfortable clarity that pride and procedural caution had cost her access to the only person capable of actually solving this. There was only one decision left that made any sense at all, however difficult it would be to make after everything that had already happened. Grace drove herself to the address Walter had provided, declining the offer of a company driver because something about this particular errand felt like it required her to arrive alone, without the trappings of her title surrounding her. The neighborhood was modest, lined with older homes and small workshops, nothing like the corporate campuses she typically navigated, and she found herself oddly nervous as she pulled up outside a converted garage with its door propped open against the evening heat. Inside, Hunter was bent over a different engine entirely, some local client's aging sedan rather than anything resembling the sophisticated aircraft systems he had once designed for a living. Tools hung neatly along the walls, organized with the same quiet precision he had shown in the hangar, and a child's drawings were taped near a small desk in the corner, crayon airplanes soaring across construction paper skies. He looked up when her shadow crossed the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression registering mild surprise but nothing close to the satisfaction she had half expected to see. Grace stood in the doorway for a moment, struck by how completely different this space felt from anywhere she had encountered him before. There was no audience here, no investors watching, no engineers whispering behind raised hands. Just a man working through an ordinary evening surrounded by the simple evidence of a life rebuilt around something other than ambition. She had expected to find resentment, perhaps even satisfaction at watching her company crumble after refusing to pay him, but instead she found only the same calm steadiness that had unsettled her in the hangar days earlier. She explained the situation as plainly as she could, laying out the cascading system failures, the panicked client threatening to pull a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, the engineers who had spent 2 days failing to identify a cause. Hunter listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when she finished, he set down the rag in his hands and asked her a single question that caught her completely off guard. He asked whether anyone had bothered checking the maintenance logs from the week following his original repair, specifically anything documented after his own departure from the hangar. Grace admitted she did not know, and Hunter explained, with no trace of bitterness in his voice, that he had warned someone in passing on his way out that day, mentioning to one of the junior technicians that the auxiliary sensor module he had replaced was part of a batch that should be checked for similar hairline defects across the rest of the aircraft's redundant systems. He had assumed someone would pass that warning up the chain, but judging by the chaos she was now describing, it seemed the warning had either been ignored or never reached anyone with the authority to act on it. The implication settled over Grace slowly, heavily, as she realized that whatever caused this second failure might not be some entirely new mystery at all, but rather the predictable consequence of a warning that had been dismissed or buried somewhere within her own organization. She thought immediately of Connor, of his insistence on running his own review without ever fully crediting Hunter's diagnosis, of his vague reports that avoided specifics in ways that now struck her as deliberate, rather than merely defensive. Hunter did not press the point further, nor did he offer to help unprompted, simply waiting with the same patient stillness that had characterized every interaction she'd had with him so far. Grace stood there a moment longer, watching him in this small, unremarkable garage that somehow felt more honest than every conference room she had sat in over the past week, and she understood with sudden, sharpening clarity that the real failure here had never truly belonged to him. It belonged to someone who had let pride override caution, someone who had buried a warning rather than admit that an outsider in a worn jacket had outperformed an entire engineering department in under 5 minutes. Hunter agreed to return to the hangar that night, not as an act of forgiveness but as a practical matter, since the chaos unfolding inside Apex Horizon threatened consequences that extended well beyond his own grievances with the company. Grace drove him back personally, and the silence between them on the way felt different from earlier tension, something closer to cautious understanding than hostility. When they arrived, the hangar was still bathed in harsh work lights. Exhausted engineers slumped against tool carts, Connor pacing near the cockpit access stairs with the frantic energy of a man watching his career unravel in real time. Hunter moved through the aircraft with the same unhurried precision as before, but this time he requested full access to the maintenance logs rather than relying solely on physical inspection. A junior technician, visibly nervous, pulled up the digital records spanning the days following Hunter's original repair, and within minutes Hunter found exactly what he suspected he might. An entry from the day after his departure noted his verbal warning about the batch of auxiliary sensor modules, but the entry had been marked as reviewed and dismissed less than an hour after it was logged, the dismissal authorized under Connor's own credentials. Grace stood beside Hunter as he reviewed the timestamps carefully, her expression hardening with each line that confirmed what he had already told her in the garage. The warning had not simply been overlooked through oversight or miscommunication. It had been actively closed out, buried under a classification that suggested someone had reviewed it and determined it required no further action, despite the obvious risk that an entire batch of defective components might still be installed somewhere in the aircraft's redundant systems. As Hunter continued digging deeper into the logs, a second discovery emerged that complicated the picture even further. Buried within procurement records was a contract renewal for the very electrical overhaul system Connor had originally proposed during the first failure, a $12 million deal with an outside vendor that had quietly moved forward despite the board's decision to table the project after Hunter's initial repair made it unnecessary. The vendor in question, according to public filings Grace pulled up on her phone right there in the hangar, had business ties to a private consulting firm where Connor's brother-in-law held a senior position. The implication hit the room like a physical weight. Connor had not simply made an honest mistake in his initial diagnosis. He had continued pushing for an expensive, unnecessary overhaul even after evidence proved it unnecessary, and he had buried a legitimate safety warning that might have prevented this second crisis, possibly because acknowledging it would have undermined his case for a contract that personally benefited someone close to him. Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach as the pieces clicked into place, anger replacing the exhaustion that had weighed on her for days. She called Aaron Foster immediately, and within the hour he had arrived at the hangar himself, reviewing the logs and the procurement records with the same methodical patience he applied to every major decision affecting his investment. He said little as he read, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and when he finally looked up, his expression carried none of the calm composure that had defined him throughout the entire ordeal. He instructed Grace to convene an emergency session of the board immediately, regardless of the late hour, because what they were looking at went far beyond a simple maintenance failure. Connor, realizing the walls closing in around him, attempted one final defense, insisting that the contract renewal had been a routine procedural matter unrelated to any personal benefit, that the dismissed warning had simply been a clerical oversight buried under the chaos of managing multiple priorities at once. But the timestamps told their own story, and the financial ties were impossible to explain away as coincidence once Aaron's own legal team began cross-referencing the documentation that same night. Before the emergency session had even fully convened, security had already been quietly notified to ensure Connor did not access any further company systems, and by the time the sun rose over the airfield, his employment with Apex Horizon had been suspended pending a full investigation. The relief of exposing Connor's misconduct lasted barely a few hours before a new crisis arrived to replace it. Early the next morning, representatives from the logistics conglomerate that owned the troubled aircraft delivered an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation or delay. They informed Grace directly that unless Apex Horizon could conclusively demonstrate the jet was fully safe and reliable within 48 hours, they would terminate their entire fleet maintenance contract and move their business to a competitor immediately, regardless of any explanations involving internal corporate misconduct. The timeline felt almost cruelly tight given everything that had already unfolded over the preceding days. 48 hours meant identifying every remaining defective component from the same faulty batch, replacing each one without introducing new errors under pressure, and then conducting a full test flight that proved beyond doubt the aircraft could perform flawlessly under real operating conditions. Any single mistake during that window, any oversight born from exhaustion or haste, would not just cost the company this one client, but would likely trigger a broader exodus of confidence among every client watching how this resolved. Grace gathered her remaining engineering staff that morning, explaining the stakes in terms stark enough that nobody in the room mistook the gravity of what they faced. The company's survival, not merely its reputation, hung on the next 2 days, and everyone present understood that failure now would undo whatever goodwill the previous exposure of Connor's misconduct had temporarily earned them. Several engineers, normally confident in their abilities, exchanged uneasy glances, painfully aware that they had already failed to solve smaller versions of this exact problem twice already. The question of Hunter's involvement hung unspoken over the entire meeting, since everyone present knew he was the only person who had successfully diagnosed and resolved any part of this ongoing nightmare. Yet nobody dared assume he would simply return a second time, especially after the company had publicly reneged on its promise to him just days earlier. Grace excused herself from the meeting and drove once more toward the small garage on the edge of town, uncertain whether she would find him willing to help or finished entirely with an organization that had treated him so poorly. She found Hunter exactly where she expected, working through his evening routine with his son seated nearby doing homework at the small desk in the corner. She explained the new ultimatum honestly, telling him plainly that she understood she had no right to ask anything further of him given how the company had behaved, but that hundreds of jobs and the futures of people who had nothing to do with Connor's misconduct now depended on whether this aircraft could be proven safe within 2 days. Hunter listened quietly, glancing briefly toward his son before returning his attention to Grace, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. He was under no obligation to help a company that had broken its word to him in front of 200 witnesses, and every reasonable consideration suggested walking away, returning to the simple, steady life he had rebuilt for himself and his son after losing everything else that once mattered to him professionally. Grace did not push him, did not offer additional money or incentives, recognizing instinctively that this decision had nothing to do with financial compensation and everything to do with whether he believed the effort was worth making at all. After a long silence, Hunter finally spoke, asking only one question that revealed exactly where his priorities had always rested, even during the worst of the company's betrayal. He asked whether the people whose jobs depended on this outcome, the engineers, the ground crew, the support staff who had nothing to do with the boardroom politics that had wronged him, deserved to lose their livelihoods over decisions made by executives they had never personally met. Grace answered honestly that they did not deserve that outcome, and Hunter rose from his workbench, told his son he would be home before midnight, and reached for his jacket. Hunter arrived back at the hangar just after 9 that evening and immediately took control of the entire diagnostic process, a role nobody questioned this time, not even the engineers who had once dismissed him as an unqualified outsider in a faded jacket. He organized the remaining team into focused groups, assigning specific systems to specific people based on skill rather than seniority, a structure that stood in sharp contrast to the chaotic, defensive scrambling that had characterized Connor's leadership throughout the entire ordeal. Within the first hour, the atmosphere in the hangar shifted from desperate panic into something resembling disciplined urgency. He began by pulling every component from the same defective batch identified in the procurement records, cross-referencing serial numbers against installation logs to locate every single instance where one of these faulty modules might still be hiding inside the aircraft's redundant systems. It was painstaking work, the kind that demanded total concentration after an exhausting week, but Hunter moved through it with the same steady focus he had shown since first stepping into the hangar days earlier. Engineers who once snickered at his appearance now followed his instructions without hesitation, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never second-guessing his judgment. By 2 in the morning, the team had located and replaced 4 additional defective modules scattered across redundant systems throughout the aircraft, each one a liability that could have triggered another cascading failure had it gone unnoticed. Hunter personally tested each replacement, running diagnostic sequences twice for verification before moving to the next system, refusing to rush, even as exhaustion visibly weighed on everyone around him. Grace stayed through the entire night, bringing coffee, fielding occasional calls from anxious board members, watching a process unfold that felt less like crisis management and more like careful, deliberate craftsmanship. As dawn approached, Hunter completed a final systems check, walking through every diagnostic readout personally rather than delegating the verification, a thoroughness that left no room for the kind of oversight that had caused the second failure. By sunrise, every indicator across the cockpit display showed clean, consistent green readings, and Hunter declared the aircraft ready for its critical test flight, with a confidence that carried none of the desperate hope everyone else in the hangar was clearly feeling. Julian Brooks climbed into the cockpit shortly after 7 that morning, having gotten almost no sleep himself after volunteering to remain on standby throughout the overnight repairs. He ran through the full pre-flight sequence methodically, watching each system respond exactly as it should, and when he finally taxied the Gulfstream onto the runway, the entire engineering team gathered near the hangar doors to watch, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten beneath the weight of what this single flight would determine. Representatives from the logistics conglomerate stood nearby as well, having flown in personally to witness the demonstration firsthand. The aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the morning sky with a smoothness that drew a collective exhale from everyone watching below. Julian took the jet through a sequence of test maneuvers over the following 90 minutes, pushing systems through stress conditions designed to expose any lingering weakness, and at every stage the aircraft responded flawlessly, without a single warning light, without a single irregular reading. When the jet finally touched down and rolled to a stop near the hangar, Julian emerged from the cockpit with a wide grin, confirming aloud that the aircraft had performed better than it had on the day it first rolled off the factory floor. The conglomerate's representatives, having watched the entire flight with skeptical, guarded expressions, finally allowed themselves visible relief as Julian delivered his report directly to them. Within the hour, they confirmed in writing that the maintenance contract would continue, expressing interest in understanding who had led the overnight repair effort that had solved problems their own consultants warned might take months to resolve. As the news spread through the hangar, exhausted engineers who had worked through the entire night without rest erupted into spontaneous applause, the sound rolling across the tarmac as the morning sun climbed higher over the airfield that had nearly lost everything just days before. 3 days later, Grace called a company-wide assembly inside the largest hangar at Apex Horizon, the same space where the original bet had been made in front of jeering engineers and skeptical investors. This time the mood was entirely different, the air thick with anticipation rather than mockery, as every employee gathered to hear what their chief executive had to say after a week that had nearly destroyed the company they all depended on for their livelihoods. Hunter stood near the front, his son seated beside him in a folding chair, the boy swinging his legs and looking around the massive hangar with wide, curious eyes. Grace stepped forward and addressed the room without notes, her voice steady despite the weight of what she intended to say. She acknowledged openly, in front of every person present, that she had made a serious mistake in allowing pride and procedural caution to override a promise made before 200 witnesses. She admitted that the company's failure to honor its word had nearly cost them the very expertise that saved their largest contract, and she apologized directly to Hunter, not as a formality but as a genuine acknowledgement of how badly she and her board had misjudged him. She then announced that the company would pay the full $1 million exactly as promised, transferred immediately rather than delayed through further review. Beyond that payment, she revealed the board had unanimously approved an additional offer, a standing consulting position granting Hunter equity in the company alongside influence over future technical decisions, ensuring the kind of institutional blindness that nearly destroyed them could never take root again unchecked. Aaron Foster, standing near the front, added that he personally hoped Hunter would consider a larger leadership role within the technical division, one that would let his expertise shape the company's direction for years, rather than simply responding to crises after they emerged. Hunter listened to all of it with the same calm composure he had carried since the very first day he walked into this hangar, though something in his expression softened slightly as Grace spoke. When it came his turn to respond, he kept his words brief, telling the assembled employees that the money had never truly been what mattered most to him throughout this entire ordeal. What mattered, he said, was being seen accurately for the first time in years, judged by what he could actually do rather than by the clothes he wore or the truck he drove into an unfamiliar parking lot. The room fell quiet as he spoke. Many of the same people who had laughed at him days earlier now listening with visible shame written across their faces. Connor's name was never mentioned during the assembly, though everyone present understood the unspoken contrast between the man who had built a fragile empire on confident dismissiveness and the man who had quietly proven everything through patient, undeniable competence. The investigation into Connor's conduct continued separately through proper legal procedures, his reputation already in ruins long before any formal proceedings concluded, a quiet reckoning that needed no further public spectacle to feel complete. After the assembly dispersed, Grace approached Hunter privately near the same boarding stairs where their entire story had begun the week before. She asked, somewhat hesitantly for a woman normally defined by confident directness, whether he might consider joining her for dinner sometime soon, making clear this invitation had nothing to do with consulting contracts or board approvals. She told him plainly that she wanted to understand the man behind the legend that had unfolded across her hangar, not as an executive seeking expertise but as someone curious about who he truly was. Hunter studied her for a long moment, the same careful, evaluating gaze he had once turned toward a malfunctioning aircraft, and finally allowed himself a small, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him since this entire story began. He agreed, suggesting a quiet restaurant his son already loved, admitting with quiet honesty that he had not allowed himself to consider anything beyond work and fatherhood in longer than he cared to admit. As the Gulfstream taxied past them toward the runway for its first official client flight since the repairs, both turned to watch it climb into a sky painted gold and orange by the setting sun, and standing there together neither one rushed to speak, each quietly aware that something new had finally begun.